I'm going to talk about reefs, ancient reefs from the Cretaceous uh, of central Texas. So, the same time that dinosaurs were walking all around Montana and Wyoming, etc., there was a shallow ocean down south in Texas, and the remains of the life of that area are spread out all over central Texas on scenery like what you see here in this title slide. If we look at the paleogeography, we have two things pointed out here. This is a map from the late Cretaceous. We're going to work on a slightly different time, but still Cretaceous. And you see Whitewater pointed out. Whitewater was landlocked at the time, but the collection site down in central Texas you see is covered by blue and was the southernmost part of this western interior seaway that split North America into two different parts. Another view of the same area with a little bit more detail, and again you can see Wisconsin up here is definitely in a land area, and this is what they call the Skull Creek Seaway is what we're looking at, particularly the southern terminus of this thing, and where the light blue rock or color meets the darker blue color, that's the edge where we drop off from shallow water environments to deeper water environments. And we're going to be a little bit farther north of that, right on the southernmost portion of the shallow water deposits. Just another view of the same thing. A lot of work has been done here in the past. There's the edge of the deep water area, this line with the little sort of hash marks on it. And what's called the Comanche Shelf is that continental shelf area behind it, and then this brownish blob over here looks like a paramecium. That's the Central Texas Platform, and that's an area that was shallower still that had a lot of interesting reef development on it. So you're going to have big reefs that are forming along this line, the edge of the continental shelf, the Comanche Shelf. Those today are in the subsurface and they drill them for oil. But up here on the Central Texas Platform was also a huge development of Cretaceous reefs, and these today tend to be exposed for us to see. But let's look a little bit more in detail on the stratigraphy. This is sort of from central Texas down south to the edge, and it's kind of hard to tell what's going on, but this data actually comes from oil wells. And so, again, Texas has been poked so many times, it's ridiculous. But what that does is it gives us a great view of the stratigraphy, and you can see classic sedimentary layer cake stratigraphy, bed upon bed upon bed, until it sort of heads off here towards the on your picture here towards the right side, which in real world is towards the southeast, and these weird sort of yellow-orange blobs, that's the edge of the continental shelf right there. But if one goes up dip farther and farther and farther, reef development would happen there as well. So let's look on a map of the area today. The lower Cretaceous rocks are shown as this light yellow pattern. They outcrop all throughout. Wherever you see this light yellow pattern, the bedrock and really the exposed rock at the surface is this lower Cretaceous area that we're talking about. And in particular, I have done a lot of work in this area called the Lampasas Cut Plain. So it's an area where there's some interesting exposures. It's where physical geography, geomorphology unites with geology. So what you're looking at here is a cross section of the areas that one would see if you're sort of standing in the plains or open areas of central Texas. And if you think back, if you want to see an actual picture of this, go back to the title slide of this talk, and you are standing on top of this thing here called the Edwards limestone, and you see here that depending on where you are on these hills, it tells you essentially where you are stratigraphically. So The mountaintops, the hilltops, are capped by Georgetown limestone and another formation I'll show later, but mostly this big, heavy, blocky Edwards limestone. The slopes are what's called the Comanche Peak LS, or limestone. Then the big, broad, flat areas are the walnut clay. And then notice it points out the Texagryphea floors. This is an oyster bank deposit we'll show later. And then below that is the Paluxy SS sandstone with some interesting faunas right there. And then lower still would be the Glen Rose limestone, which I'm not going to talk about in this slide, but I definitely want to try to see when we go there. All of this gets exposed because of several million years of cutting down by two principal rivers, the Lampasas River and the Leon River, and that's why, again, it's called the Lampasas Cut Plain, because that's the dominant river system there. A little bit closer view of the stratigraphy that's cut down. Again, this is shown as subsurface view from drilling, but at any different place, wherever you are in central Texas, these different things can be exposed. And notice that the Walnut, the Comanche Peak, the Edwards, they're not just layer caked on, as was shown in those other slides. In this area of central Texas, they interfinger with one another. And you can be at some places where the Edwards, and if time is flat here, that the Edwards was being deposited the same time as the Comanche Peak, the same time as the Walnut. And so it's kind of an interesting little setup. Again, until you sort of see the stratigraphy, it's hard to imagine. But what I envision doing and what I've been doing or accumulating data on are different very fossiliferous sites of the Walnut, Comanche Peak, and Edwards to try to get a glimpse of the changing paleoecology along this seaway in this part of the world. Fredericksburg lateral facies, let's get rid of that. Again, there's some of the names that we want to think about. There's the Edwards limestone, the Comanche Peak limestone, and then all these other weird little things here, the Upper Marl Member, Keys Valley Marl Member, Cedar Park limestone member, etc. These are all members or parts of the Walnut Formation. So basically this diagram shows the Walnut, the Comanche Peak, and the Edwards. Specifically where we're talking about is the central Texas area of these few counties, Bell County, Coryell County, Lampasas County, and a few others around here. And the stippled pattern that you see here is the outcrop belt, meaning this is where the outcrops are, or where these specific rock units are at the surface, and you can see them, study them, and importantly for us, collect them. So I'm just going to do a stratigraphic trip upwards through a lot of these things here. So again, here's a vertical section, Edwards, Comanche Peak, and then there's Walnut, and then the different members. The Bull Creek member is usually the lowest one we see, but right below that is the Paluxy, and there's a shoe for scale, and you see the Paluxy actually represents deposition on the land and on the shore, and in the first transgressions of the ocean on this. Dinosaurs lived there. In fact, there's Dinosaur Valley State Park right there, where you can see lots of these dinosaur footprints. There's a nice three-toed theropod footprint. So that's the floor. That's what all of this rock of the seaway that we're talking about is flooding onto. And so I usually try to take students to see this as sort of our starting point. Then, when we get to the basal part of the Walnut, we call that the Bull Creek member. And here's a student on a previous trip going there to collect. I always put this slide up here just to warn people that have never been there that this is central Texas. There is cactus with thousands upon thousands of both big thorns and teeny tiny more bothersome thorns all over the place. So prickly pear cactus, you kind of have to work around it, and she's using poor hammer work right here, but trying to get out some samples from this Bull Creek limestone. What we see there, a picture, it's kind of, you just see kind of limestone at this point, but you can see these sort of round objects, large oval objects. This is one particular snail, large snail that's found there. And then these elongated ones are a different snail group that is prominent there. We enlarge these things. The big ones, again, these are inches and centimeters for scale. You see, these are quite sizable. This is Peruviella dolium. It is one of the marker taxa for the earliest transgressions, both on this side of the world and down in South America. So as the temperature of the globe increased and the seaways increased and started flooding the continents, these beasts would be the large snails that would be right in the beachy area, the shallowest area. And Peruviella dolium is our northern representative, and then in South America there is the same genus, hence the name Peruviella, but different species down there. Interesting group. Now, we have a complication of where a lot of these things are deposited, in that there is this giant federal facility called Fort Hood, right smack dab in the middle of it. So if you look at this map, right up here at the top, there's the town of Gatesville. On the left side, Copper's Cove, and then in the south part, Killeen. And Killeen area has about 200,000 people that lives there, and largely that is there because of this Fort Hood area. It's the largest military base in terms of number of actual soldiers. So it is one of the largest federal payrolls that comes every other week into an area. So that's a lot of money hitting the economy, and it makes an economic boom. So these things are growing. These towns all around here are growing. There's both good and bad to that. The growth means that there's a lot of construction that exposes rock with fossils, where one can quickly collect and do these things, but then it tends to get covered up just as quickly. And so this is a good place to talk about or think about the practice of geoconservation. So if you want to preserve a certain site, or talk about a fauna that's from a particular formation or something, you have to actually think about, well, are there places that need to be conserved for their fossil content? Or is the best we can do just to collect the heck out of them while they're exposed, and then publish that data or get that in some sort of data servers that are accessible by workers out there, so at least you're conserving the data of these areas. Just the next few slides is just showing the growth of Killeen. So to go back, here's Killeen. It can't grow north because this is an active military base. In fact, see this bullseye in the middle here, impact area? This is where they're exploding things and shooting off. The tanks have drills there. There's bombs going off. Helicopters are firing missiles. Nobody's going to move or live up there. Killeen's growing, so it has to grow south. Much farther south off this map is about an hour away is Austin, Texas, the capital, which is growing north. And so the tendrils of both of these things are touching, basically. So just some pictures, some aerial views through time. This would be Killeen in 1986, 92. In particular, look at the big flat area here. This would be all walnut formation, very fossiliferous, but watch 2000, 2010, 2016. All of this is getting built up. So most of this is residential, but there's also lots of economical sort of stores and things like that, some manufacturing, but Killeen is growing. And all of these things were great, great, great fossil fields, but now they tend to be completely covered over. If we go up one member higher to the Cedar Park limestone member, this one isn't typically found very much in the area that we're talking about. And fossiliferous wise, it's not too spectacular. Again, there's a shoe for scale. You're looking at some limestone and these weird little holes or vugs here. These are burrows of clams called pholads that burrowed into the hard sediment floor of this particular part of the seaway. The shells sometimes are still there, but usually not. But they've left this sort of burrowed hard ground. This is very, very shallow water. Sometimes it's exposed, sometimes it's not. And so also part of the Cedar Park member are these curious little things where you look at them and they look like little donuts. You see the little round donut-shaped things here. These are tidal flat burrow openings for the burrows of little crawfish or shrimpy type arthropod creatures. And so these clearly indicate a tidal flat area. I call this the CFA section because it stands for Chick-fil-A. And you can see this lineup of cars here. That's the lineup for the drive-through of Chick-fil-A, which would be off to the upper right of this photograph, and this is just a little stream, a little drainage channel cut through the area here between one giant supermarket chain and then a whole line of fast food places on a highway, and the brownish, tannish, beige colored rocks that are exposed here. This actually has a nice exposure of this Cedar Park member in the lower part with the fossils I just showed, and then there's a boundary right about there. It's kind of hard to see with the next member up here. This is what we have to do in a lot of places here. You have to do what's sort of described or called urban paleontology. You basically take the fossils, take the rocks where you can get them, where there have been exposures caused by construction or work activity. The Cedar Park member is an interesting little side jaunt, and again, somebody needs to describe and talk about these burrows for us. So this is one potential project that we're talking about. More importantly, if we go up to the upper formations here, the upper members of the walnut, the Keys Valley member, marl member, and then it's not named here, but it's typically known as the upper marl member. These are the truly fossiliferous members of the walnut formation. Just tremendous amounts of fossils here. And one of the things that it's noted for is this huge occurrence of what we call OMOs, or oyster mass occurrences. Basically small, or, well, we'll see, quite expansive reefs built of oyster bivalve shells. Just a sample of this. You are looking here at what I call the Harker Heights High School section. This part no longer exists. It's now the tennis courts and playing fields of this high school. You can see the suburban houses off on the edge here. But again, before this was covered over, they plowed this out to prepare for it. Rain washed it through, and really just about every little bump that you see sticking out here, believe it or not, is a fossil of some kind. So fossil collecting in the particularly the upper marl member, but also the Keys Valley, literally just involves walking over this area and picking up everything you see. And what are you going to see? There are gastropods galore, many species. Two of the more prominent ones, Turritella sp. It's just, we're not entirely sure of the species here, although somebody could work on that. And then Tylostoma chihuahuense, and you see this a nice, beautiful snail, again, present by huge numbers in this area. Echinoids, including heart urchins, so this is Enalaster texanum. It's related to starfish and sea urchins, and you see that you can collect these things in huge, huge numbers, and you can get large ones, small ones, medium-sized ones. You basically get beautiful, good populations of these. So I have one student that's already working on the paleobiology and paleoecology of these heart urchins. There are also regular echinoids, so sea urchins that you're more used to. So this pincushion type organism here is Tetragramma hilli. Might be a different species. We need to work on that, and she's doing that. But picture this thing covered in spines, more like the classic sea urchin that you know and think about when you think about sea urchins. Also, lots and lots of clams. So deep infaunal bivalves, again, you see these are quite boisterous. Some of these are internal molds of Protocardia multistriata. And again, this is just one example of the infaunal bivalves that are there. And they are, again, quite abundant, quite abundant. There is the occasional rare, very rare vertebrate fossil there. So there's a shark tooth, and you can occasionally get a shark tooth, a shark vertebra for the upper level carnivores of the area. And again, you might see here, this is, I call this the dentist office section. It's because there's a dentist office that has been built right next to this section, and now it's covered by a little strip mall area. What else do you find? Ammonites. So this is a part of an Enganoceros pyrdinale. The whole thing would have been a big spiral here. So picture again like a nautiloid, an octopus stuffed into a coiled shell. And so this is the Bull Creek member from the Fort Hood area. This is the Keys Valley marl member. I call this the HEB section because right off to the left over here, that's the edge of a giant grocery store, one of the biggest grocery store chains in Texas, HEB. And you see sort of a little barrier fence. On the other side of this fence is a suburban neighborhood, and they just kind of cut out of this hill. And my mom sent me to go get some groceries over here, but I saw this little hill exposed, and just a short time collecting gave me a nice handful of these Enganoceros type ammonoids, which are very common in this Keys Valley marl member. There are also some big ammonites. Again, this is calipers, about 6 inches in scale. This is the definitive index fossil for this member, Oxytropidoceras salasi, and this is also from that HEB section. But what's become more interesting in the most recent years are these oyster mass occurrences, these OMOs. And so here's a map of a sort of early Cretaceous world, but it's supposed to represent different time slices. And the blue dots showed Jurassic OMOs. Don't see any on this map. The early Cretaceous OMOs are shown as these orange dots, and then the late Cretaceous OMOs are shown as these green dots. Land is shown as the gray emerged areas, and then areas of high reef abundance are shown as this sort of pale green patch. They need to have extended that up here, but one thing, it definitely shows the early Cretaceous OMOs of central Texas. And I've looked at and read the papers for these other described OMOs, and they are small and they pale in comparison to what we have in central Texas. And so someone definitely needs to work on and describe these oyster mass occurrences, especially in the context of them being an ancient example of a reefy type or an oyster bank type that's common today and of economic value. People eat oysters, and also of conservation importance, because oysters are a group that, you know, if the environment's wrong, they are in bad shape. So something pretty interesting to work on here, these OMOs. And these OMOs, here's a nice little sort of streaming diagram to sort of classify these things. And again, it goes to what we've already talked about in paleontology class. Is this a group of organisms that all lived in this gregarious fashion, or were they thrown together by storms? And most of these things are actually of the autobiostrome model. And I'll talk about these. A lot of terms. We love terms in geology, but some are indeed storm deposits, but most are actual biologic buildups of these. What are the two prominent oysters there? Two of them. Exogyra texana. Here's some pictures of these things from the Keys Valley Marl. Again, the Harker Heights High School section. And so you've got big oysters. And then notice in the upper corner of these things, these weird impressions. These things lived in an area that had a lot of soft muds in which they would sink. And so the little larval spat would settle on any hard surface there is, which included a lot of old shelly debris. And as it grew, its shell grew over and then retained the imprint of the organism or the fossil shell or living thing that it grew on. And so this one grew on a Turritella snail. This one grew on one of the little local corals that are here. And studying these things have the name bioimmurations, is an interesting way to get a glimpse of the fauna that's not always preserved there, but the oysters preserve them as these impressions on the shell. Then there is the devil's toenails, the Texagryphia mucronata, and these biostromes typically are kind of a mix between gregarious buildups, but also just sort of thrown together by storms. They have this delightful name, devil's toenail, because people, seeing these things thought these were cast-off toenails from the devil. This is from the Wright Ranch section, which is an area that I was allowed into for many, many years. And you can see these beds. So these students are collecting here, and each of these beds that are sticking out, these are beds that are solid, packed Texagryphia oyster shells. And then the beds in between represent this as well. And these sort of biostrome beds cover literally thousands of square kilometers in central Texas. They're exposed in the surface all over the place, wherever the walnut is. And then in the subsurface, they've been encountered in oil wells and water wells everywhere. If you look at these things, again, a hammer for scale, you go up, it's busted up pieces of limestone, but you can pull out and get beautiful samples of these Texagryphias by the, again, uncounted billions upon trillions. So we've got these two major groups, the Exogyras and the Texagryphias. Both of them form these OMOs, and that would be a really interesting project to look at the OMO distribution. Above the Walnut Formation, then, we get into the Comanche Peak limestone, and this represents deposition in deeper water of an open shelf type environment. It looks different. Here's a picture of it on the ground. The Walnut Formation is below the green line. And you can see again here, you can just walk around, pick up these fossils here. Remember, the Comanche Peak forms the slope areas of the hills, and you see right away it's a denser, harder rock that is resistant, and it has this more beige, lighter color. You look at a close-up of it, it has what we call a classic wavy bedded look, and so it's not as easy to pluck out individual little fossils. One has to sort of find fossils on this and get them out, and then typically prepare the rock this way. Just another picture again of this boundary. Again, in the background you can see suburbia encroaching. These students are walking on and collecting that walnut member, but the Comanche Peak member, or Comanche Peak limestone formation, is right here. Just a picture of this to sort of harken back to that notion of geoconservation. This picture that you're looking at right here with these students is this spot right here, down here. And you can see all of these suburban homes encroaching, encroaching, encroaching. Basically, what's happened is, in this area south of Killeen, they have built upon any flat area, which is always, as we go way back to that geomorphology picture, the walnut formation. It's soft, they can plow it over, shape it, put a house on it, boom, done. They build these homes right up to the hillside, which is the Comanche Peak and Edwards Formation, and then they stop. And as you can see here, this area is cleared and platted and ready for the next row of houses. This area doesn't exist anymore. So for our aspect of geoconservation, we collected the hell out of this and have lots and lots of data basically for something that's no longer there. It's completely covered over. Here's just another sort of picture of the same thing. Here's the Walnut Formation, and then there's the Comanche Peak. Above here, there's a couple of houses at the top. You see the privacy fences fencing it off. And I call this the Target section because this is just behind the large Target store in Killeen, Texas. And this area is still barely exposed, but you see they are building a retaining wall to cover over and plaster over this entire hillside that they've exposed here because they don't want it to slough off and keep washing into things. So the life history of this is such that it's probably not going to last forever. Okay. Well, what do you see when you go to the Comanche Peak Formation? Well, here's a beautiful little scallop shell. So like the Shell oil symbol, Shell gas station symbol. This is Nethia occidentalis. And this is in Gatesville, Texas, at what I call the water tower section, because the water tower for the little village of Gatesville is right there above it. And this is one of the few places where one can get really detailed faunas from the Comanche Peak Formation. Now here you're at this water tower section. It's on the top of this little airy hill off to the right. But this little exposure back here, this was the backside of a store. And then the store was here in the parking lot. This was all covered over for a couple decades. The business failed. The building fell apart. They removed it, and now it is exposed again. So there's been a reversion back to exposure. These limestones of the Comanche Peak, you see how bone white they are. And typically, they are usually fossil poor. But in this site, there's a lot of fossils. And we have a huge collection of the fauna in this area. And that also needs to be described as a nice ecologic project of this sample of the Comanche Peak Formation, which would be a project that doesn't have very many things to compare with. Basically, you'd have no competition. What else can we talk about? Well, at this Edwards Comanche Peak contact, the Edwards is the formation right on top of it. So here they don't really show the Comanche Peak because it doesn't, it's not exposed in every place right below the Edwards. Remember, there's this interfingering relationship. The Edwards is a big, thick, heavy, dense, hard limestone, but it weathers out and it makes all these holes. And in fact, there's a lot of giant caves. And sometimes I've taken students into caves, commercial caves, where this is so. But water will sort of wash through this. It goes down, it reaches the impermeable layers below, which both the Comanche Peak limestone and the Walnut Formation are. It can't go down any farther, so it goes laterally. So any place where the Edwards is exposed and meeting the formations below, there are springs that emerge from these areas. If you go to a place where this is, again, Here I'm sitting here, I'm sampling the water in this area. You see there's all kinds of beautiful little vegetation, unique vegetation there. There's the hard layers of the Edwards Formation. Why there is a cavern, a little cavern here, is because, again, for millennia, water has washed through, laterally then moving through and dissolving the top part of this Comanche Peak Formation. These springs are all over central Texas, and I'm also interested in them because they have a unique living snail fauna, Elimia comalensis, and here my hand is emerged in the spring, beautifully chilly cold spring in Salado, Texas, and all these things you see here are one species, this Elimia comalensis, and Elimia is part of a family of snails that have been around since the Cretaceous. They've been called in print the snails that the dinosaurs saw. So I also do sort of water monitoring and ecology, not paleoecology, of these Elimia as well. We have a congener. We have Elimia livescens, and another related snail that lives up here in Wisconsin in the Mukwonago River and a whole bunch of other rivers and lakes. And it'd be an interesting little project to compare these two. But really, this is of more concern because this is a red listed, identified as a endangered species. There's collecting them. Just pull them out and you get them by the hundreds upon hundreds where they do exist. Now let's talk about the Edwards itself. The Edwards has prime examples of these rudist bivalve reefs that you're seeing here. They are common in the Cretaceous and in the Jurassic. This is a weird time period where reefs were built not by corals, but by clams, and corals were sort of sidemen, just a very minuscule part of the reef building on the side. And so these giant things that you see here, these are not corals, those are clams, rudists. If you look at a map of the distribution of rudists throughout the Tethys, again, you see sort of the blue line is sort of the belt that constrains them, and then the blue dots or blue squares represent extensive exposures of these things, and again you see them in this Texas Cretaceous area. So it's kind of blessed in this central Texas area for having a lot of these exposures of unique paleoecological occurrences. Another picture just showing something similar, a little bit closer now. You see the arrangement of the states, and then in the subsurface. So none of this is exposed here. What we're talking about for our exposures is sort of right where these letters XAS are concerned. But the barrier reef at the edge of the continental shelf extends this way and to the south and over here. It actually is larger than the Great Barrier Reef of Australia today. This is the longest continuous stretch of continental shelf reef that ever existed on planet Earth. And so again, people are interested in this for, sadly, drilling for oil in the subsurface, but the ecology of these reefs, it's hard to know them from the subsurface cores, but we can study them in their up dip on the shelf equivalents over here. So what do you typically get? The rudist reef fauna. All of these things that you see here, with the exception of one, are bivalves. So Monopleura, Etoradiolites, Caprinuloidea, Tucasia, Chondrodonta. These are large. These can be, a foot, 2 feet in size and length. Giant clams that built up these huge resistant reefs. This little thing down here, Cladophilia, is the spaghetti coral. It's a scleractinian coral, which is just kind of a minor little thing that's also present there. If you actually go look at most exposures of the Edwards Formation, Remember that water courses through it. So look at all the holes and vugs and everything. Again, this explains why it's so prized for the oil people in the subsurface. All of these holes are filled with oil. They just have to poke a hole into it and suck the oil out. At the surface where we are, we just see the holes and the voids. All of the water that's coursed through over the millennia has then changed this limestone and dolomitized it. I put a sad face there because it means that the preservation is typically not that good. Just another picture of this. You can see little images of things that are tantalizingly biological, but also that high porosity, lots of holes here, iron staining. Again, it means that preservation is typically poor. Another picture, here's a rock hammer for scale, and these big sort of things that you see here, these are some of these Caprinuloidea giant clams building this massive framework for this reef. Well, a few years ago, we found a place where there was a nice chance to get some exposures here. So this is an aerial view. You've got a highway running here. You've got this hillside exposed over here. The fence line shows the edge of Fort Hood. So Fort Hood continues off to the right of this picture, but this is private ranch land. This is the Wright Ranch, and for several years I got permission to go onto this hillside and again sort of tilt this view so you can see it this way. Here's this little road running up to the surface here. I'm going to go back just one over here. This little sort of cow pond over here in the upper port, you can see some little lines here. These are the Texagryphea beds. The slope of the hill will be the Comanche Peak, and then the top of the hill's the Walnut, or the Edwards. Again, you can sort of see it over here. You've got this slope of Comanche Peak, and then the Edwards is the cap. The top here, this is a cell phone tower. So you've got a nice pad and then a giant tower they built up there. They cut a nice road that you can just walk up the hillside. And if we put the geologic map up here, we've got the Walnut Formation, the upper marl member at the base here. We've got the Comanche Peak, and then at the top we've got the Edwards. So this is one place, it's very few, where all three of these formations can be visited at one time. So the Comanche Peak is here, but look at the Edwards. The Edwards was the tantalizing one at this point. And again, a different view from the surface. Look at the surface here and see these nice circular structures. You are looking at the upper expression of a whole bunch of little patch reefs, all sort of growing together and making this agglomeration of giant reef exposure across this continental shelf. This would be very much like if you took an aerial photo above some of the little islands and blobs of reefy deposits in the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, or the Florida Keys. Again, and this is one of the few places where this typically gets exposed. The reason why this is exposed here is because in the early 90s, this whole hillside burned down. Prior to that, it would have been just covered by dense forest like this and soil and not seen. Now we know there's giant reefy deposits here, and so we went to sample these things. You're looking now at the edge of this, so you see it makes nice cliff exposures, and we brought along some core drilling material to drill out and get some samples through this. That's what these guys are doing. But more importantly for me is the chance that there's some silicified preservation there. So again, the map on the left is a map of the Edwards Formation and Comanche Peak. You've got the boundary between the two, and that little yellow triangle is shown over here as this place where it's washed out. Again, it's washed out because of the spring activity. Where you've got the boundary of the two, and this is a classic reef core deposit. And so Melanie, former student, is standing here, and if this is her hand up here. If you go into this cave and look at the upper surface, you get a view of a whole bunch of these fossils with this beautiful silicified preservation. And you can actually sort of pick out what a lot of these things are. And so here's this Chondrodonta munsoni. You've got Caprinuloidea exposed. You've got Eoradiolites davidsoni, a whole bunch of things here. And the chance exists now for us to try to get these things out and turn them into individual little fossils, because we can put them in acid baths and work them and try to get some of these things out. This is a lot of work, and so this probably is not part of a student project, because this is going to take many years of effort. And in fact, after several years of being allowed to be on these exposures, they've kind of cut it off. But hopefully we can start sort of etching out and getting some of these other beautiful fauna over here as well. And then sitting on top of the Edwards Formation is another formation, and this one's interesting. It's the Kiamichi. You see it's this darker color, and here I have the students collecting here. If you go there, this one has a whole bunch of weird different fauna, including a brachiopod. Brachiopods are more common in the Paleozoic, and they're very, very rare afterwards, especially in the Mesozoic. But there's one that's common here with the cute name Waconella wacoensis. And here's a whole bunch exposed right here. And brachiopods can live in very, very low oxygen conditions. This is one of the things that we've shown and we've seen in several places in the Cretaceous. These reefy deposits, they build up these giant reefs, and then they were periodically killed by anoxic or absent oxygen or low oxygen conditions. And then quickly, organisms that can deal with these low oxygen conditions will move in and dominate, like these Waconella wacoensis on the bottom. But still swimming around, we have micromorphed fauna. So now what you're looking at here are ammonites. Look at the scale. These are millimeters ticked off here. These, in normal conditions, would be giant ammonites a foot in diameter, 2 feet in diameter. They are miniaturized here. So in these basically toxic, anoxic, low oxygen waters, these fauna, if they still exist there, they become micromorphed or stunted. So we can tell they're still adults by the number of whorls, but they're miniaturized. And so now here they are here, and they are preserved as pyrite. So this is fool's gold preparation, which is FeS2, which is another indicator of low oxygen conditions. And so these things are also exposed here. I typically end this talk by saying questions, any questions, and thanks to the Wisconsin Space Grant Consortium, the different groups that have helped fund it here. For students like you guys, this sort of gives a glimpse of things or places where different projects could be done. So a general sort of listing would be paleoecology of this or that formation, this or that member. Also, you could say I'm particularly interested in someone picking up a study of these oyster mass occurrences, but also the Keys Valley Marl and Upper Marl member. And these, gosh, those tidal flat things, the Comanche Peak Formation. A lot of things to talk about and see. And again, next spring, or next fall, fall of 2021, the Geology 492 class is going back here to collect. And so projects that would get started here on samples we have now could be augmented and the projects developed more and go off into different directions upon collecting next year in Central Texas. And I should also say that the undergraduate research program and these other agencies here have been very good about helping fund students' projects to get here. So you can get quite easily, small grants from different sources to help do this research. Hope some of you can join me.